Hello, Dylan. I'm Shireen from Beirut.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening.
And where are you calling from?
I am calling from the land that is occupied by settlers known as Corona, California, Southern California, Riverside County, so-called Inland Empire, surrounded by Gabrieleño, Serrano, Tongva, and Luceño, and other peoples all around here, long indigenous genealogies.
Yeah, and immigrant also histories and genealogies. And I want to ask you to start with the site where you are, where you've been living, and how it's inspired your practice and your activism or your political engagement.
It's a great question, and it has forced the questions like this have forced me, challenged me to constantly think and rethink the terms that activate me. I'm not sure at what point I stopped, but I don't think I identify as much as an activist as I used to. And that's not because I'm not active. It's not because I'm not involved in a variety of collaborative and collective projects. It's not because I'm not engaged with organizations and groups of people who are organized but refuse to name themselves an organization. It's because I have become increasingly skeptical of the effective industrialization and commodification of the term activist. So nowadays, I think about myself as somebody who enjoys being invited into collaboration, as somebody who is a co-conspirator. Um, I half jokingly, but actually mostly seriously, have embraced the role that I think others have asked me to embrace, which is that of something effectively like an intellectual mercenary or a scholarly mercenary being pulled into different contexts to share certain skill sets, very narrow skill sets, very humble skill sets, but skill sets that I've nonetheless built and refined over many years. Um, so that's how I think I would identify myself the most. And I think that the ways in which I've inhabited institutional settings, including but not limited to higher education, so-called higher education institutions, colonial settler research universities in particular, as well as living in this geography, this place of Riverside County in Inland Empire, Southern California. They have indelibly informed and educated my approach to analysis, to collective work, and to the forms of political and cultural radicalism that I've increasingly invested myself in. We can talk about that a little bit, but I will say this: I will say that living in Riverside County was my primary education in the nuances as well as the blunt force of what I call in my my last book, White Reconstruction, what I name as multiculturalist white supremacy. There's no better primary political education in the formations of multiculturalist white supremacy than this place I live, this political geography, this cultural geography in which I live, where you have the entire spectrum of people in overwhelmingly, brown, black, 1 degree removed from migration and immigrations of various kinds. This is the kind of geography it is, and there are strong reactionary, not just conservative, reactionary tendencies, as well as I think radical and proto-radical tendencies, sometimes embodied in the same people. But the identifications with anti-blackness and white supremacy and coloniality and heteropatriarchy and misogyny are so powerful here, and it's been like this, in the 25 plus years that I've lived here. And of course, there's all the forms of in the current book that I'm finishing now, of what I've been calling liberal counterinsurgency, that are absolutely experimented on and refined at the site of the research university, right? So it's all those things, all the above.
Okay, so before we get to your book, which I'm very excited to do, I wanted to ask you about, first of all, so this disruption, this constant disruption that happens, right? It's not individual, right? It's collective.
Right,
So could we
right.
please talk about this? Because I know you a little bit, and I know that you're constantly resisting this idea of the individual, the man. And so let's talk about how this collective sort of resistance or disruption happens around you, where you are on your side, and not necessarily at the university, which we don't need to focus on too much because I know you're really active at many levels.
Yeah, I mean, I view at this point, I view the university not as a site of transformation or promise or potential. I view it as a foundational adversary. I view well, I'll say the university generally, but when I say the university, I mean every institution in higher education for the most part, right? Not just research universities, not just highly funded, well-capitalized institutions. I'm talking about underfunded public universities like the one I work at. Like I work at University of California, Riverside. I've been an employee there for more than 25 years. It is not a well-funded university, and nonetheless, I consider all these institutions to be part of a totality of enemy institutions. They are enemy institutions. That is, I think, the most important shift in my own understanding, my own collective understanding of relation to these places in the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 years. So when you think about the disruption, I think the disruption happens at the level of, most importantly, at the level of a grounded political analysis of one's inhabitation. And we learn lessons about this all the time, ideally in a manner that allows us to share collectively and hive our intelligence and our counterintelligence in a collective way, in manners that track with experiments like Strike MoMA, right? When Strike MoMA forms, what you see is this insurgent collective of artists, revolutionaries, anti-colonialists, etc., who are inhabiting the relationship to the art economy as well as the museum apparatus, the philanthropic and kind of racial capitalist museum apparatus differently. They have an analysis of it, and then they decide that they will no longer consent. They will no longer kind of normalize the anti-Black coloniality, the chattel coloniality of those institutions. So we think about examples like that, and then we think about what I think is also a growing alienation that different collectives of people have with the institutions that they inhabit on an everyday basis. And I think it becomes a deep responsibility to politicize the collective misery. That's, I think, how I would phrase it at this point. There's a collective misery that is seeping from um, almost every conceivable institutional site that I can imagine at this point, right? There's misery, and it's a totality, right? It's not just because of different fascist and authoritarian state and shadow state formations that are happening around the world. It's not just because of economic and climate collapse. There's something about the fact of institutionality, the fact that modern institutions seem to be reaching a certain moment of obsolescence that they are scrambling to resist, that is then emanating the misery outward to its denizens, primarily its exploited employees and those whose geographies and lives institutions occupy and disperse. And I'm talking about every imaginable institution, from corporations to K through 12 schools to nonprofit organizations to various facets of the state. So the last thing I'll say about this point is that in doing the collective work of politicizing our collective alienation and misery, what I think we begin to identify is the already existing fact of an insurgent totality, right? And this is where I think I work to depart from the permanent sense of sometimes resignation, of surrender, um, of effective collective political paralysis that threatens um, to depoliticize the misery, the collective misery, and turn it into a form of surrender. What we need to understand is that there are so many different formations of refusal, of rebellion, of revolt that happen in ways we might not recognize until we are in intimacy with these sites of misery and politicizing misery. And I think what we can identify is a messy insurgent totality. And I think it's about stoking an affinity and an intimacy with those forms that are around us.
Yes, and even maybe even further to see, to envision the fact that there is no separation at all actually between us, each other, between land, between countries. Of course, the universities removed from, you know, sites of war, sites of genocide, sites of struggle in some ways, and yet it fuels them. And the fact that we envision our struggles as intertwined, as not even intimate, but completely actually infusion, right? It changes completely the perspective, and it really helps us see man as the problem with this with this colonial order, with this post-slavery order, with the order that we're in today. And that's what
Yeah,
your
I
book
mean,
is talking about.
yeah, no, and I think what the logical conclusion that we reach if we take what you just said seriously, the only logical or kind of principled, I won't even use the word ethical. I'll say the only principled conclusion that I think we can collectively reach is that the relationship to this figure of man that we're talking about, which of course comes from the great Black radical thinker Sylvia Wynter. Um, yeah, her lifelong project of radically disarticulating the dominant colonial humanism that has shaped the civilization project over the last half millennium. That is Sylvia Wynter's life work, and I think she gives us this gift of completely dismembering the figure of modern man that has toxified the everyday lives of the majority of this planet, who will never, ever, ever be able to fulfill the colonial demands of that figure, right? And yet we bust our ass to try to fulfill that anyways, right? This is how we kill ourselves, right? This is how I've been killing myself, you know, for my 52 years on this planet, is trying to fulfill the demands of that figure of man. So I'm at war with that, right? So if we take what you're saying seriously, if we take what Sylvia Wynter is saying seriously, then the only principled relationship that we can collectively have to the figure of man is one that is homicidal, is one that is destructive, that the figure of man needs to be immolated, destroyed, and dismembered, thrown into the trash bin of history. We have to get rid. The only way that we can have a possibility to thrive in any, and I probably won't make it, by the way. So, like, I don't say this with arrogance. I say this with humility and a sense of like my own limited lifespan, right? I probably won't do it, right? The figure of man and kind of the solicitations of civilization have fucked me up way too much, you know, such that I can be, but you know, I'll tell you this, please give me credit. I at least know it. Right? Like I recognize this. I know I'm at war with this. But if we take what you say seriously, that is the only principled relationship we can have. So we got to figure that shit out. Like how do we destroy the figure of man in a way that is permanent, right? Like I know we can do it in a momentary ways with each other. How do we do it in a way that is permanent? And I think that requires a different kind of insurgent collective infrastructure that is simultaneously material and aesthetic and imaginative and fantastic and all the rest, speculative and all the rest of that.
Yeah, and I feel we're doing it in so many ways. And Sylvia Wynter taught us about autopoetics, so the ways in which our neurological systems, our ecosystems are
Yes.
constantly
Yeah.
shifting our terms, the ways in
Yeah.
which we see, perceive the world. And so aesthetics, poetics, philosophy are really important ways for us, languages, narratives. What
Yes.
I forgot what she called them, but we have to go back to the text for the next conversation and close read because her writing is so brilliant. And today, part of what we're doing together is to redefine terms. So I wanted to ask you about your new book and your upcoming book, and to define the term insurgency and to define the term counterinsurgency, and then why do you have machine in that title?
Yeah, yeah. So let me share with you all the cover. That's the cover of the book. And I want to honor my great friend, my cousin in coloniality, Shalene Rodriguez, who I know that you've had come through here before, but the great revolutionary Bronx-based artist was generous enough to do this original, you know, handwritten art or hand-drawn art for the cover of the book. So I wanted to make sure I share that and shout out Shalene. I don't have any tattoos on my body, but once I get a tattoo, I'm getting it from Shalene Rodriguez, who is also, you know, one of a kind tattoo artist. So at some point I'm gonna get a tattoo, probably on my fucking forehead. Uh, so, so it's interesting that you asked this question about definitions of terms because the way I engage it in the book is I actually start with what you can think about it as the official U.S. Joint Forces military definitions of counterinsurgency and insurgency. And I do that not because I'm interested in platforming them. It's because I'm interested in reading uh, military doctrine or pseudo doctrine as archival material, right? This is primary research material. So in other words, I'm not elevating it. I'm actually subjecting it to, I think, a disloyal, maybe even a treasonous type of reading that I want to understand what is revealed in the definition, right? Don't take the definitions at face value. What is revealed in the definition? And if you look at their definition in the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, also known as Joint Manual 3-24, used to be known as Field Manual 3-24. It's taken different iterations, but commonly it's known as the U.S. Counterinsurgency Field Manual. They define insurgency, and I'm paraphrasing here, as any formation of unrest, of insurrection, of rebellion that threatens the legitimacy of an existing state order, right? The focus is very much on the state. You know, there are gestures to things beyond the state, but it's primarily about a state order. And the state order can either be an established government or it can be an occupying version of a state, right? So there's a looseness to the definition of a messiness, a sloppiness to the definition of insurgency that I think is a result, number one, of the fact that it's impossible to actually define insurgency to define it in a definitive way, right? If you excuse like the double use of that term, to define it in a foreclosed way is actually impossible. So this sloppiness is somewhat intentional, I think. You know, what it provides is a kind of cover um, for a military force and for the discursive and cultural and propaganda apparatuses of the state and of the military to simply name insurgencies at will, right? So they name them at will. And if you think about insurgency according to their own definition, then one would, in a literal sense, one would locate something like Nat Turner's Rebellion in Southampton, Virginia, threatened to actually overthrow and destroy the chattel plantation apparatus, not just in that geography, but to inspire its immolation throughout. I mean, Nat Turner's Rebellion is a central moment that forced the what became known as emancipation in the United States, right? Don't get it twisted. This wasn't about fucking Abraham Lincoln and bullshit. This is about enslaved Africans involved in insurrectionist revolt in which there was actual, grassroots armed spreading uprising against the plantation order and against the agents of that plantation order, sometimes including their own kin, right? Captive people's own kin who were complicit in maintaining that order. So according to the sloppy definition of insurgency, something like Nat Turner's Rebellion would be put right alongside something like January 6th, the Capitol building, right? The attempted seizure of the seizure of the Capitol, but they would put them in the same classification, which in most ways makes no fucking sense. Okay. And of course, we also, when we do that exercise, we also understand that the identification of insurgencies is not equal, right? There are certain insurgencies, there are certain forms of insurgency that fit that sloppy definition that are not only not policed and repressed by the state, but are actually part of what the state does. Like I refer, for example, to January 6th, in Washington, D.C., people talked constantly about how, oh yeah, a lot of current former police officers, prison guards, military people involved in that action. And I was like, my reaction to it, this was actually, January 6th was not an insurrection. It was a police action. Like it was actually a police action, right? If you want to call it an insurgency, it was an insurgency by and led by the actual police. So that's insurgency. It's sloppy by intention. And then I can pause there and then talk about what counterinsurgency is.
Yes, yes. And by way of leading us to that point, I wanted to ask you about also fugitivity, because you discussed
Mm,
the fact that, that revolutionary movements are often illegible, that they're in excess, that
yeah.
that they create new codes, which connects us to Sylvia Wynter's idea too. And I was wondering about the question of fugitivity, and perhaps you can explain what inspires you in terms of the movements around us now.
So I'll say this. I'll say I like fugitives. I like you know I'm down. I'm in community with fugitives. I'm in community with so-called criminals. Um I do my best to be in relation to folks who are engaged in projects of what we would nowadays call ungovernability. You know, I'm here for all that. I'm here for all that. And at the very same time, I will also say we have to carry with us a critical skepticism about how these concepts circulate, how they gain traction, and how they are subject to people's, I think, sometimes earnest and well-meaning, and other times exploitive and opportunistic deformation. In other words, I have experienced people attempting to name activities as activities of fugitivity that I would never place under that category, right? Like people talking about cool shit they do while they're on the job as acts of fugitivity. And I'm like, nah, dude, you're getting paid to do that. That's actually like, that's in your job description. That's not fugitive. That's not how what I think about as fugitivity. When I think about fugitivity, I think about, the folks who have talked about it, think about fugitivity generally in line with a long Black radical tradition, but specifically a Black insurrectionist radical tradition, a Black radical insurrectionist tradition, in which fugitivity was a form of both escape and self-protection and delimited moments of self-determination, but it was also acts of rebellion against the property order, in the sense that people were turned into chattel. So it was a rebellion, a fundamental rebellion against the property order. And it was a prefiguration of the experiments of community building that could happen in the midst of the settler slaver's death, right? Like there's a way that that genealogy, that history of fugitivity exposes the fragility of the slaver settler's flesh, as Hortense Spillers, the great Black feminist literary critic Hortense Spillers, the um, I think classic article that she wrote. Now it's been almost 40 years, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, where she thinks through how it is that the transatlantic chattel order reduced African bodies and African humanity to flesh. And I think that there's something when we read someone like Hortense Spillers, we can and read alongside somebody like Frantz Fanon, the great anti-colonial theorist and revolutionary theorist, somebody like George Jackson, the great, U.S. incarcerated revolutionary, the inspiration for the Black Liberation Army and member of the Black Panther Party. When we read someone like Hortense Spillers' theorizations of the flesh alongside these other thinkers, what we can also understand is that there is within the moments and acts of fugitivity and of ungovernability and of escape and of criminality, a demystification of the settler slaver order as nothing but another pound of flesh. They are flesh. They can be reduced to flesh too, right? They are not this kind of transcendental figure of man that we've been bombarded into and solicited and groomed into accepting over our many, many generations. So I think that fugitivity, as far as I'm concerned, is something that is an accompaniment and at the same an accompaniment as well as a prefiguration of the kind of possibilities, of communal possibilities, of possibilities for subjectivity, in autonomy from a plantation order, from a settler slave order, from a colonial order.
Okay, and then what's the step from autonomy to dismantling, burning down, destroying, sabotaging, looting the
I
order?
think it's yeah, no, well, I think this is where we learn from the historical record, which is the kind of the working concept that I've kind of focused on in recent times is guerrilla war, right? To think about guerrilla war. And I'll tell you, part of this is because I feel such a deep debt of gratitude to my teachers, and it was the late great Professor James Turner, one of the founders of Africana Studies, who gave so many of his students. But I remember there's a particular moment that he and I had when I was leaving the institution, in which he told me that my job was to be an intellectual guerrilla fighter. Like he said, that's your job. And I was 21 years old. I didn't, I mean, I could sense the gravity of what he was saying, but I didn't understand it. You know, I took it as a really cool, abstracted metaphor, right? Like he was trying to pump me up and give me a pep talk, which he was also doing. I would say it took me about 10 or 15 years because that never left me. You know, that moment never left me. That charge never left me. It took me probably about 10 or 15 years until I was into my early 30s to understand that Professor Turner was not being superficially metaphorical. He was being deeply metaphorical. The charge was in most ways a material and literal one, as well as a metaphorical one. And this was because it took me that long to better understand all of the layers that are involved in protracted anti-colonial liberationist guerrilla war, which absolutely entail an artistic wing, an intellectual wing, a pedagogical wing, as well as all the shit we see in Hollywood and on, the colonial news, which is bush warfare, urban guerrilla warfare, what the Zionists and the imperial apparatus have now come to dismiss as apolitical terrorism, right? Like this is what we. So guerrilla warfare has all these layers to it. So when I think about the relations of abolitionist and anti-colonial and liberationist destructivity, right? We're not just involved in creation and world making. We have to be involved in collective work of destroying certain relations, destroying certain infrastructures, in fact, or at the bare minimum, recognizing that the societal infrastructures that surround us that are structured in dominating and oppressive violence, sometimes they're on the verge of collapse and we don't recognize it that way, right? And then they're on the verge of collapse because for the most part, they're actually unsustainable, and I'm talking about everything from the power grid, right? I can give you that concrete example. I live in this U.S. state called California, where there's constant wildfires. And the cause of the wildfires generally are not arson. They're generally connected directly to failures of a modern power infrastructure, which actually cannot accommodate either the degradations to the population that are created by corporate racial capitalism or the kind of concentrations of real estate and population and brick and mortar infrastructure. So it's a collapse. It's actually a collapse. It is showing us that this thing will eat itself up, right? So we can think about this, we can think about all these things simultaneously, and we have to, I think, take a more serious politicized collective relationship to collapse, which means we might not even need to do the work of destruction. This fucker might be destroying itself, and we just actually have to take on a more serious analytical and political relationship to the surrounding collapse, including of so-called democratic orders.
Absolutely. First and foremost, the illusion of democracy and
Yeah,
the idea of counterinsurgent machines as genocidal, ecocidal machines, bio-necropolitical machines that are also self-combusting.
yeah.
Could you please tell us about this? How do you tackle this in your forthcoming book?
Yes. Okay. So I identify something called the counterinsurgency machine because I take seriously the archival evidence of what is happening all around us in terms of this constant collapse of the civilization project, of the project of empire, whatever, however you want to name it, where you are, right? Like everybody's going to have to identify it differently based on their own geography and where they are. Um, so counterinsurgency in this archival definition that's provided by the apparatus of the U.S. Joint Forces is about warfare that is waged to defend the legitimacy of a state order, right? So it's warfare over legitimacy. That is what is specific about counterinsurgency war. It's not like other forms of war. It is war waged over the terms and fabric of legitimacy. Legitimacy is slippery as hell, right? Like an order can be legitimate in one moment, and in the next breath, that legitimacy gets undermined or it might even just implode, right? So we know legitimacy is profoundly fragile, even though it will present itself to us as if it is transcendental and unassailable, you know. And yet, in the current moment that we, I think, are privileged to inhabit in many ways, we're burdened to inhabit this moment. We are privileged to inhabit this moment. We are privileged to inhabit this moment because all around us is evidence of collapsing legitimacy. You know, the legitimacy of all these different political, economic, state, and other cultural forms of order are collapsing all around us. They're revealing their fragility all around us, et cetera. So, what then happens in this kind of spectrum of counterinsurgency warfare is that the state and military begin to understand around the early 21st century that counterinsurgency warfare will never gain any traction if it depends primarily, centrally, not to mention exclusively, on military methods, right? They realize that counterinsurgency warfare has to be waged through cultural, aesthetic, discursive, and non-state apparatuses. And this is where the machine comes in. This is where I'd name the counterinsurgency machine. The counterinsurgency machine are all of the extra state, the non-state dimensions in institutions of counterinsurgency warfare, including philanthropic apparatuses, humanitarian organizations, non-governmental NGO organizations, nonprofit organizations, and oftentimes, and this is the thing that I hope people will challenge each other on. Sometimes it's the very so-called social justice movements themselves that we are involved in, that are actually involved, that are actually undertaking the work of restoring and defending the legitimacy of an existing collapsing order under the terms of social justice, right? So I think we have to understand that this machine is something that incorporates and solicits and grooms many of us. And I'm talking about us. I'm talking about any of us who identify as actual actual or intended agents of some form of radical transformation or radical resistance to state and corporate violence, right? Sometimes the forms of social movement that we get pulled into are actually engaged in a scramble to defend the legitimacy of the existing order through militant renovations of it. You know, and we can see this with almost every social movement that I think has gotten traction in a global sense around us. You know, I think we have to be skeptical and challenge those things.
And you call that liberal reformism. And I wanted to ask you about, since these concepts and the words we're using today, for example, revolution,
Yeah,
activism, abolition, decolonization, feminism,
right.
LGBTQ, these words have all been co-opted by fascism, right?
Yeah,
Ecological activism, and so on.
yeah,
And so, what is the dynamic between insurgency and counterinsurgency? What
yeah.
is the relationship between the two? How do they sort of feed, fuel each other, and how does insurgency constantly disrupt and sort of destroy that machine, the
So this
fascist?
is so this is the secret that is highly evident if we take a disloyal reading toward the archival material that the U.S. Joint Forces provide us, as well as, by the way, as well as almost all of the other kind of military and military academic literature on counterinsurgency. They give us a blueprint for insurgency, right? And this is not entirely surprising because this is what happens when we read colonial and repressive texts in a certain kind of way. If we read them disloyally, we realize they're giving us a playbook in how to actually undermine and destroy them, not just materially, but also in relation to their legitimacy, right? So, so the relation between insurgency and counterinsurgency, what we need to understand is this: one of the primary objectives of contemporary counterinsurgency, especially what I'm calling the counterinsurgency machine, which involves all of these non-state, liberal humanitarian, liberal reformist, and liberal social justice apparatuses, right? One of their primary objectives is to pick off and absorb actual insurgents and pull them back into the, I think, extended arms of counterinsurgency warfare, ideally in ways where they don't even recognize it, right? This is why when you think about what the U.S. Joint Forces did when they revised their counterinsurgency curriculum during the early 2000s after the onset of the so-called protracted permanent war on terror, right? They what keep this in mind. They pulled in as focus group participants. They pulled in people from the interdisciplinary academic humanities and social sciences. So not just the CIA funded area studies people. They're pulling in people from like gender and feminist studies, from iterations of what we would now call American studies, ethnic studies, interdisciplinary comparative literature, and so forth. Why? Because what they needed was more information about how they could undertake a form of counterinsurgency operation that did not involve the military, that actually involved solicitation and absorption of people who are part of or potentially part of the insurgency, and to bring them into dimensions of counterinsurgency that would be framed by rubrics of decolonization, right? Of feminist reform, feminist state and extra state reform, and in recent years, even of abolition, right? Now, if we look at the post 2021 period of abolitionist so-called organizing or abolitionist mobilizations, what we can identify is that there are so many iterations of abolitionist and abolition adjacent um, organizing and institutional mobilization and initiatives that are actually anti-abolitionist, right? They're actually using the terminologies of abolition and sometimes decolonization, oftentimes of queer and feminist liberation, to engage in activities that are about a restoration of the legitimacy of the state and a restoration of confidence in the existing racial capitalist order. That is what counterinsurgency looks like. So when you say fascism, the other thing we have to take seriously is that fascism is not just one thing. It doesn't just take one form. Part of what I think George Jackson taught us 50 years ago is that what we have to identify is how it is that fascism is a changing body of institutional infrastructural relationships. But in the contemporary moment, its most dangerous form might be its liberal form, right? To think about liberal fascism. So part of what we need to understand about the contemporary moment of fascism is that what we identify as this antagonism among different political factions of the dominant colonial order is actually a fight among fascists, right? What you see is a skirmish between liberal fascists and people who you might call classical fascists, the classical reactionary fascists, who are easily named as fascists, right? The Trump administration is easily named as a fascist. Israel is easily named as a certain kind of colonial fascistic tendency. I think what is more difficult for people is to name something like the order that Obama represented, right? The normalized forms of liberalism that people are accustomed to both inhabiting and fighting within, right? That is another form of fascistic liberalism. There's another form of fascism that was named 50 years ago by George Jackson and theorized by many others. So what we're inhabiting is a moment in which there's a war among fascisms, and many of us who identify as radicals, revolutionaries, etc., are being asked to participate in defending and vindicating the liberal fascist order. We must refuse that, right? We must refuse that. We must think more creatively and strategically about the relationship we have to the multiple versions of fascism that surround us.
So let's take a concrete example, right? There's an exhibition at a major museum about abolitionist art, or for example, art from indigenous people, right? And these indigenous people or these people from, anti-carceral communities are
Yeah.
addressing these so-called or traditionally radical questions of, liberation, decolonization, and so on. So we're going to this museum, which is funded by military funds, by carceral funds, by
Yeah.
big pharma, and so on. And then we're viewing this art by so-called radical artists. And so for many of us, it's a total mindfuck, including for the artists,
Yeah.
which actually leads to the state of the art field today, which is,
Yeah.
I mean, decadence would be a very soft way to describe it, right? Because there's
Yeah.
this sort of loop in which we're stuck, where it's it's very hard for these artists to sustain themselves outside
Yes.
of institutions. So, from your analysis that you share in the book, could you explain this case study of what happens when the art is exhibited, for example, at the Whitney, and then what happens when we view it, when we engage with it, in this carceral, genocidal, ecocidal, liberal fascist, liberal reformist, philanthropic, I mean, and so on, in all these institutions.
So I'll say this. I hope folks need to understand that I'm speaking and thinking from a position where I am inhabiting a parallel position of being employed by and paid by a colonial institution called the University of California. There are few institutions that are more colonial and more locked into the infrastructures of genocidal empire than the University of California, right? So I say this as somebody who is the analog of the artist that you're talking about. I'm like my position might be even worse, okay? So I say this from that position. I don't say this from a position that is outside these kind of networks of drawing a salary from colonial bloodletting, you know. Um, so in that sense, I'm completely empathetic with the need in a capitalist money-based economy, right? Like to earn an income. And artists have it rough. Okay. Like there are few, I think, forms of labor that are more contingent and more fragile than that of the artist, right? Like the artist is the to be an artist is to have the life of fucking nonstop gigs. Yeah, I've seen it. Like I've been around enough artists now to like appreciate this and empathize with it. So I'm going to be the last person to tell an artist to not participate in this museum economy when they don't know how to pay rent, right? Like I'm not going to say that. What I will say is, at bare minimum, what we bear responsibility for is to stoke an antagonistic relationship with our employers, so to speak, right? That is a bare minimum responsibility. I've been doing my best to do that with the University of California, right? Like I have nothing good to say about the University of California, the UC Regents, the UC president, the chancellor of my institution. I mean, for that matter, many and many, if not most of my coworkers, they're not colleagues, they're coworkers. Most of these folks are fully subscribed to, they're fully complicit, not just complicit, they're collaborative with the logics of liberal fascism, at least, if not actual, empire. I think the bare minimum responsibility for those of us who are tied into these economies of dependence on imperial logics and institutions, our bare minimum responsibility is to stoke a radical analysis and counter-analysis of the very sites that we are inhabiting, including our texts, our art, our aesthetics, our pedagogical practices, etc. If we don't do that, then what we are participating in collaboratively in a counterinsurgent way is we are normalizing the expropriation of our labor, right? And I don't just mean the material expropriation of it. I'm talking about the aesthetic and political expropriation of our labor. If we are not constantly engaged in stoking antagonism within these already dependence inducing relationships because we need an income, right? If we don't do that, we are actually participating in that collaboration. So I think the struggle that I have learned from Palestinian and Palestinian liberationist comrades in recent years, one of the primary struggles is against normalization, right? Normalization is a term I've been using for 30 years, right? But I never understood it as deeply as I have in these last couple years being around Palestinian liberationists, Palestinian radicals and revolutionaries. So I'm not talking about a certain kind of um, Palestine solidarity political formation that really just wants a fucking ceasefire and actually wants a certain kind of normalization of a relation to Israel. You know what I mean? Like that. I'm talking about the incorrigible liberationists, right? The incorrigible Palestinian liberationists who understand that part of liberation war is a permanent liberation war against Zionist normalization, against the normalization of Nakba, you know? So I think we can take that political lesson and understand it in the context of the fucking museum, right? Like I get it. I get it. You got to draw a salary. Like I take it seriously as part of my responsibility in relation to the University of California. Okay. University of California is my fucking museum. They want to exhibit me too. Believe me. They've tried to do that shit. Okay. Um, and so my job is to be in community with as many people as I can be to wage guerrilla war against that normalization. And what this also means, I would say, for people who are taking in the art at that museum, your responsibility then is to engage in a particular kind of viewing, reading, and knowledge practice. That is your responsibility. Nobody's going to do that shit for you. Okay, you have to, you have to inhabit. If you're going to set foot into that museum, that is your responsibility to understand exactly what you just outlined, Shereen. Like who is funding this exhibit? And that's just not hard to find out. right? You could use your smartphone and figure out what's behind this, what apparatus is behind this exhibit in this museum. Once you embrace that responsibility of an analytical, a radical, critical, analytical viewing, reading, and knowledge practice everywhere you go, especially when you're a so-called spectator, now you're no longer a spectator, you're a participant. And hopefully that means you will be a participant in denormalizing precisely what it is that that museum is trying to normalize. That is counter war. That's insurgency war, right? And if you don't engage in it, then you're actually in collaboration with the aesthetic counterinsurgency that the University of California is trying to install, right? But I mean, this is protracted and it is permanent, right? These responsibilities are protracted and they are permanent, but they're also beautiful and wonderful and invigorating and emboldening. Let me tell you that. Like I feel when I'm with people engaging in this form of thought, of shared thought and work and anti-normalizing labor and experimentation, we feel, I dare to say, we feel invincible. We feel like they can't, we feel like they can go ahead and come for us because like they're going to have a really hard time getting us.
I was thinking about the idea of aspirational fascism and the
Yeah,
idea of the betrayal of the, selling out of the people in our, among our comrades, in our communities. But what you're saying is that it's worse than betrayal. It's actually genocidal, sort of enabling,
yeah,
and participation in what you call the spectacle, the theater I mean, what I'm going to paraphrase as the spectacle of terror. And I was
yeah.
thinking about a talk you gave recently about actually this idea of smoke, and to which I responded with this idea of noise. And this idea that we discussed of actual anarchist poetics and guerrilla
Yeah,
poetics. And
yeah,
so maybe we could end today's conversation with
yeah.
thoughts on what these anarchist poetics might feel like based on maybe the global intifada, based on also your study of autonomous movements and anarchist movements.
I think more of us who have the tendencies toward deep, principled, rigorous skepticism, if not opposition towards state and state-like authority, need to embrace an identification with anarchism and at bare minimum anarchistic movements, experiments, and politics. I say this in part because I've been cajoled by by my anarchist loved ones to be more overt and intentional about embracing anarchism and anarchistic politics because we're in a moment where anarchists and the term anarchism have become primary targets of the most carceral, militarized, repressive mechanics of the state, right? People and formations that are labeled as anarchists are open season for criminalization, policing, and capture at this point, if not elimination. And we see it all over the planet, right? Like anarchism and anarchist become terms of immediate depoliticizing, disposal, and military targeting. On the other hand, if we challenge, so again, when we see the state doing this, again, they're showing us a fucking blueprint because as sloppy as their use of anarchism and anarchist might be, believe me, there are layers within these state formations that fully understand the threat that anarchist and anarchistic projects pose to the existing state order. Right. And I mean, I'm talking about global anarchism, you all. I'm not talking about what in the US people have dismissed as lifestyle anarchism, meaning a very kind of performative and superficial theater of anarchism. I'm talking about people who are committed anarchists and or who may not people who may not even identify overtly as anarchists, but who are engaged in anarchistic projects, meaning projects which exemplify a self-determining autonomy from state and state-like power, from state and state-like authority, right? Who refuse the notion of centralized bureaucracy and centralized infrastructure, and who are demonstrating all of these successful ways in which different communities can actually stoke good living, thriving, mutual mutual proliferation, right, so to speak, freedom, like actual liberation, liberatory projects of freedom that do not rely on these centralized bureaucracies, right, that don't rely on the state, that don't rely on capitalist and corporate, handouts or corporate and capitalist investments and grants. So I think there's a responsibility to pay attention to the ways in which projects like that are actually all around us, right? They're actually all around us. These are not fantastic abstracted possibilities. They're already existing experiments that are proliferating all over the planet, right? And I think that we can identify them as anarchist or anarchistic in a way that is productive, in the sense that it draws us into a deeper relationship with this long political, intellectual, and aesthetic tradition of global anarchism. Some people call it third world anarchism. There's folks, my good friend and colleague, comrade William Anderson talked about Black anarchism. Ashanti Alston, the well-known anarchist panther, hardcore anarchist panther for many decades. And Ashanti Alston's book just came out with AK Press. Everybody go get that, right? Like if you want a primer into how it is that different liberationists have kind of mapped out their own political biographies and reached this kind of trajectory in which they have fully identified, embraced the political principles and political identity of anarchism. I think that teaches us something, right? And it teaches us something that is in creative and corrective relationship to the way that the state will provide these caricatured, a kind of moral panic type notions of anarchists and anarchism. So I think we have to stay there. I am there right now. I'm trying to deepen my familiarity, my affinity, my intimacies with anarchism, with anarchistic projects, both historically and around me. And I think that's where I'm going to stay for a while.
And I was thinking also about the creative destruction around us since the global intifada and since Black Lives Matter. And we can, think about many examples like Standing Rock, Occupy, and so on.
Yes.
To think about disruption, tactical disruption. For example, the
Yeah.
action is literally disrupting arms sales or arms
Yeah.
productions at the factory, decolonize this place, disrupting
Yeah.
the museum opening, the biennial opening. These spectacles of wealth and liberal sort of humanism or whatever you want to call it are being creatively disrupted in a way that sort of reimagines what it means to come together, to assemble, to gather, to refuse, to riot.
Yeah.
Noise demos. I was thinking a lot about noise demos, dead-ends, where they stage. All of the occupations on university campuses, the encampments. If
Yes.
you could tell us how this has really shifted or transformed our relationship to each other
Yes.
and space and land.
So here's what I think has been so emboldening and activating about the proliferation of militant collective commitments to disrupting business as usual all around. The examples you just named, along with many others, right? So we can think about the levels of street-based rebellion and insurrection that proliferated in response, um, to the refusal of the normalization of anti-Black police killings. Okay, well, I mean, everything from the immolation of police stations, many of which have not been rebuilt. Okay, um, to other forms. I won't get too far into it, but to other forms of sabotage, other forms of disruption, other forms of militant disruption of the existing order. So what has, I think, almost universally unfolded alongside those levels of disruption and principled destruction have been autonomous anarchist and anarchistic models of study, of research, of artistic production, and of community making, right? They have been simultaneous with each other. In fact, it is arguably in many cases, it is the work of sabotage and destruction that creates the possibility for new autonomous self-determined forms of study, research, and community building. I say this because those things are those are the sites, those are the experiments to which I have been connected very happily in the last, I'd say, 7 or 6 or 7 years. Like these are the things I get invited into, and I'm so privileged and so honored to be part of these things. But I also understand them as part of this protracted, multi-level, multimodal insurrection against the existing order. Like these are not domesticated sites of study and research, right? They're outside the so-called academy. In many ways, they are against the so-called academy. They're absolutely outside the space of the university. In fact, what people are explicitly asking me to do in many cases is like, hey, yo, could you donate some of that labor that you give to the university all the time? Could you donate? And it's not, they don't use the word donate. I'm just saying that. Could you gift us some of that? Could you come over here and gift us some of that? We don't have money for an honorarium. We just need you over. And people don't, thankfully, people don't even like, they don't, most of the time, people don't even have to say that to me. The honorarium thing, because a lot of academics, like they have a minimum price. They're not going to come and talk to your study group unless you pay them, right? And I'm very happy to say I'm a cheap date. Okay, I'm a free date when it comes. Like I'm happy to be fucking invited. So I hope people see this and they invite me because I don't need an honorarium. I'm like honored and privileged to be part of this multimodal creativity that is happening, that is only happening because of the militant commitment to destruction and disruption that surrounds these sites of study, research, and community making. Like that is what I'm talking about. I could give examples all day, by the way, but I'll just say that those of y'all who have done that with me, like you know who you are, I have a session next week with a group. It's a kind of semi-national hemispheric group that would probably rather I didn't say who they were, right? But like they're inviting me in as part of this modality of their rethinking what their approach to what you're calling intifada, what others would call anti-colonial. You know what I mean? They're assessing it and they're asking me to participate in that assessment and to bring it to them. So that's my humble contribution. But I would also say what it's afforded me is this kind of insight, this perspective such that when we talk about an insurgent totality, right, it's not just the people and the geographies that are the totality. It's the modes of the insurgency that are a totality. That's what I think we need to embrace, because then if we do that, then it means that all of us can and must be part of that insurgent totality in whatever humble way we can do that.
Yes, and always in solidarity with resistance movements on the ground and
Yes.
underground, militant movements.
Yes.
And so to bring us back to this idea of interconnected struggles, always echoing
Yeah.
the militants around us, around the world, and from history, the ones who came before us.
Yes. Yes. The bare those of us who don't have the capacity or the will or the ability to be involved in the underground, which is probably most of us, right? Like a lot of us fantasize about it, but like I would be a fucking liability to the underground, right? Like the underground does not need me in that sense. Like most of us would be a liability to the underground. However, what I do think we have is a responsibility to valorize, praise, and defend the underground, right? To refuse the tendencies of the counterinsurgency machine to disavow the underground, right? And by the way, having said that, shout out to my former student, longtime comrade, Casey Goonan, who is now a federal political prisoner, serving an outlandish sentence of almost 25 years over property destruction. Casey is in Pennsylvania right now. I will defend Casey until the day I die, right? Casey should not be in prison. And we need to defend Casey. And I think about Casey as just one example. I think about Casey Goonan as one example. We have to refuse that disavowal. And so the interconnectedness of these struggles, it's solidarity means more than just a profession of convenient affinity. Okay, what it also primarily, I would say, what it primarily means is militant gestures of defense, if not valorization, precisely when there are arms of those interconnected struggles that are being subjected to criminalization, to pathologization, to caricature by dominant orders, including our liberal social justice establishments, our liberal social justice organizations. They're the ones who are oftentimes the first to disavow the underground, to disavow those who are militantly engaged in direct material challenge of the existing colonial and chattel order.
And the least we can do is to amplify their demands, right? To
At
literally.
bare minimum, at bare minimum. Yeah,
Thank you
yeah.
so much, Dylan. Thank you, and I hope we speak again soon.
This is
And
an honor. We're gonna speak again.
yes, yes, of course. Next time we'll close read Sylvia Winter together with a
Oh
group of
man.
can
Oh, that would
maybe
be awesome. No, this is great. No, thank you for doing this. I'm so grateful. I
thank
know a
you.
lot of people are grateful. I appreciate you so much.
Have a great day.
Okay, love you. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.